Hello everyone, welcome to the delegation of the Ismaili Imamate, and also a very warm welcome to the November edition of Global Reads. My name is Sophia Mirzayee. I'm the Education and Youth Engagement Officer here at AKFC, and I am very thrilled to be your host for today's event. I want to start off by saying that I thoroughly enjoyed delving into the Ministry for the Future, and I gleaned quite a few interesting reflections from it. And so I'm very much looking forward to what is sure to be an incredibly insightful discussion on the content and the themes that are presented in this very timely and compelling book. But before we get into all of that fun, I do have a few housekeeping items that I just quickly need to touch on. First, a note to all of you that there will be a Q&A after the discussion. So for those of you who are joining us online, I encourage you to participate by using the chat box on Zoom. And for all of you in person, if ever a question comes up during the discussions, make sure that you're noting it down and keeping it close to you for whenever we do open up that Q&A. And secondly, just a reminder that as we are sharing space together and as we are engaging in meaningful dialogue with one another, both virtually and in person, that you are being mindful and as respectful as you possibly can be towards one another. So that's it for all of my housekeeping items. I now have the great pleasure of calling up to the podium our CEO, Khalil Shariff.
I was going to say the crowd usually erupts in spontaneous applause when that introduction is made. So thank you for obliging. It's a real delight. Welcome. My name is Khalil Shariff. I'm the CEO of Aga Khan Foundation Canada, and this is one of our most delightful little initiatives, our book club. And I'm just brimming with enthusiasm about the very specific people who have come to join us today, who I'll introduce in a second. But let's start by acknowledging that we're gathering here on the traditional land of the Algonquin people. And as I think many of you will know, for millennia, since time immemorial, the Indigenous people of this area have gathered here in Ottawa at the place where the three rivers meet. And in fact, what I've learned about the Algonquin is that for generations, they were understood to be marked by their hospitality, because people, in fact, Indigenous people came from a very, very large catchment area every summer here, hosted by the Algonquin. And it was a time, it was a place and a time for exchange of relationships, of goods and services, but also, of course, of ideas. So in a sense, we gather here today in this place at this time in perpetuation of that very important long tradition taught to us by the Indigenous people of coming together in dialogue and of exchange. In this case, in the service of the great challenge of our time, which is climate change. Today we have this extraordinary author and this extraordinary book, Kim Stanley Robinson's The Ministry of the Future. I don't know how to describe this book. It is really in a genre of its own. The copy I have has on it, I think, the blurb says, the best science fiction, nonfiction book I've ever read, I think. So there's a characterization. Let me tell you what I think it is. It is masterfully crafted as a work of art. It is thoroughly researched as a statement of the condition that we confront as humanity. And it is infused with a very rich moral texture as an ethical kind of call to arms, as a reflection about what we owe to each other and to this planet that we inhabit. And I would say it is very unusual to see those features converging in a single work. And in the Ministry of the Future, Kim Stanley Robinson has served us and has served the world with exactly such a contribution. So it is with great humility that we have invited Kim Stanley Robinson to be here and to engage in this conversation. And it is a particular privilege and delight that Catherine McKenna is with us to do this. I just want to get this right. Catherine's currently the chair of the UN Secretary General's high-level expert group on net zero commitments. That's a mouthful, which is a recognition of the global stature that Catherine has when it comes to questions of the environment and climate change. I think you'll all know that Catherine McKenna was our first ever Minister of the Environment and Climate Change. She served a very important and consequential tenure in that role, and then was subsequently the Minister of Infrastructure and Communities, which is, in a sense, a climate change portfolio as well, with another name. But Catherine has, for many, many years, been a leader, even before her political life, in civil society, calling for ways in which Canada might exercise a particular brand of global leadership that was infused with a sense of what we owe to the world. What is it that the blessings of being in this place and having the opportunities that this country affords all of us, what obligations does it present to us, and indeed what opportunities does it present to us to exercise a certain kind of leadership in the world? And Catherine's career has been marked by that, both her civil society work, her political work, and now her work globally. So we're just delighted that Catherine agreed to do this. When we approached Catherine, she said, "Look, I'm pretty busy, so I'm not like gonna read a whole new book." She said, "Well, I'll do this on one condition," she said. "If you can get Kim Stanley Robinson, I'll do this." And that's all the team needed to hear. And so I'm delighted that Catherine agreed. I'm even more delighted that Kim Stanley Robinson agreed, because that allowed Catherine to do this. And we're in for an extraordinary conversation. And if you haven't read the book, an incredible introduction to this wonderful piece of art. So welcome, Catherine McKenna.
Thank you. Well, thanks very much, Khalil, and it's great to be at the Aga Khan Foundation. I mean, we'll talk a bit about the book, including inequality, which comes out very clearly, and who is most impacted by climate change. Because that's the work that the Aga Khan Foundation does in Canada. It does it globally, and it's always great to be here with the folks of the Aga Khan Foundation, and hopefully folks around Canada and around the world. So it is kind of funny, Stan, that apparently it's Stan. So it's funny, Stan, because I really didn't think this was going to happen, because I was really busy with this expert group report, this extremely long name, but basically how do you hold companies and financial institutions, as well as cities and regions, accountable for net zero commitments. There was also the COP coming up. Plus I have 3 kids, and one just started university who's calling me about this paper, and then, you know, I was thinking, I don't really have time for this, and I have my own book club. And so I was like, well, throw in a Hail Mary on this one, because I had your book and I hadn't quite finished it, and I loved it, so I just said, well, if you can get Kim Stanley Robinson, which you won't be able to get, then I will do it. So lo and behold, of course, the Aga Khan Foundation always delivers. So thanks very much to you, Stan. So, I mean, I loved this book. I can't tell you, like, I loved it on, you know, I love reading, so I loved it as a story and all these different chapters and, you know, different narrators, and you'll get a kick out of it. If you haven't read the book, all the different voices you hear. But I also loved it as someone who just spends a lot of time trying to figure out what our problem is. Like, why can't we just tackle climate change? Like, it's the weirdest thing. And you cover a lot of the threads of the challenge. And then, I mean, it's very harrowing to get there. But in a way, we get there. The world is able, despite a lot of people dying and a lot of hardship and a lot of experiments, we get there. But, so when you wrote this book, you're a sci-fi writer, but I didn't know you also wrote climate fiction, but far further into the future. This is much more short term. Like, why did you write this book?
Well, thank you for that, Catherine. And before I answer you, I want to also say thank you to Khalil Shariff for his beautiful introduction, very moving, and also to the AgaCon Foundation. I appreciate this very much, and especially for them getting Catherine McKenna. It's an honor to be working with you. To be talking with you after such a powerful career, and I want to hear more about that too and make this more of a conversation. Only a few times have I been able to talk with actual ministers for the future, but they do exist in this world already, and I know that one of the reasons that this book has gotten the response that it has in the last couple of years since it came out is because there's a lot of people working hard to deal with the ongoing climate change catastrophes and to get to a balance with the biosphere. These people are ministers for the future by also being ministers in the present. And I don't just mean government officials, but everybody working on this. So the book, I wrote it because I'm a science fiction writer, so then I think about the future. This is a very easy, simple, and powerful definition of science fiction. Stories set in the future. Well, then you have to run scenarios. You have to express or maybe explore your theories of historical change. Why do things change? Why do they go better or worse? What's keeping us from making positive change? And then writing out, for about 30 years, I've been writing utopian science fiction where things go better in the future rather than worse. Well, that's getting more and more challenging, I have to confess, as these last 3 decades have passed, because we haven't coped with an ever-present danger that we've known about for 30 years, which is the release of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere that's cooking up the planet and causing all kinds of other problems. So I wanted to effectively put all my cards on the table, write a novel that told the story of the next 30 years going well, despite the obvious problems, setbacks, defeats, and the hole that we're starting in from now. And also try to make the reader believe it while they're reading the book. This was important to me, a sense of realism. Like, at no point did I want the reader to say, oh, but that could never happen. So we're in the nation state system, we're in global capitalism. We don't have time to reinvent all that, obviously. So we have to use these strange tools that we have been given by history to solve this new problem. And that's interesting. And so it makes a new story. And there aren't that many news stories, to tell you the truth. So for me, it was an opportunity as a writer and as a political citizen, as a kind of activism by telling this story. And I think I've discovered in these last 2 years that story is not common yet in our culture, how things could go well, and that people are hungry for it, really hungry for it. And I guess I'll finish here by saying I wrote it in 2019. That was a darker time than now. Trump was president, Bolsonaro was president. It wasn't clear that was going to change. And also the pandemic had not yet hit and sort of slapped us in the face with how the biosphere can change everything, can kill people, and how society can quickly respond to that and cope with it. So here we are in 2022. I think we can make a better future than the one I described in Ministry for the Future.
So that's good. Sometimes I'm an optimistic realist, sometimes I'm a realistic optimist, but it's good to have your optimism, because I think, I'm just coming back from COP27. Was anyone there? I don't know if anyone in the room, you're probably watching. I mean, these things are so bizarre. Like, I actually think, and maybe we could talk about that, the idea of a ministry for the future, maybe we need that. Because right now, okay, so let's talk about the good things of the COP. After decades of talking about loss and damage, and we know that there's historical, the historical emissions from developed countries are having a real impact right now on developing countries. So there's this fund. There is no money for this fund. The other funds, the 100 billion, the governments around the world were not able to find the 100 billion. There's still money needed for an adaptation fund. We're talking about the 3 trillion needed to meet both the energy transition, but also the sustainable development goals. So I was like, and that is the big success. And I'm not understating it, because people, especially from the global south, have advocated for this for a very long time. But that's, seen as success. And on the flip side, we can't even talk about what needs to be done, which is literally phase out of fossil fuels. And then we have all these oil and gas lobbyists there who are distracting and causing havoc, and petrostates, which you're well aware of. So you came up with this idea, and I was like, well, this is brilliant. Maybe this is what's going to happen. We're in COP, and we're 2025, and they're going to announce, there's going to be this big announcement, the Ministry of the Future, for the future, which is really having, a ministry focused on future generations, because it seems like all we can do is focus on the here and now. We have a very hard time. So this idea, do you think that we need a ministry of the future, or do you think, was this a call to action for people finally, whether it's policymakers, which I saw Ezra Klein said this should be essential reading for policymakers. I could not agree more. But is this the call we need? And it's so hard, but is it having groups that are solely focused on what the future is going to look like, and not the future, i.e. tomorrow, and I need to still make money, or, I'm in, Canada's economy is focused on oil and gas, or whatever it is, but that is actually thinking about the future?
Well, you've been in government, and so you can probably confirm this. If there was a department in government that could come in and tell you that everything that you were doing was wrong and needed to be overruled by them, that would not be a popular agency.
Sometimes I felt like I did that.
Yes. Yeah. A Department of the Environment is a kind of ministry for the future, because protecting the environment therefore protects the biosphere that's going to support the future generations. So I guess this used to come up in U.S. government. Could there be a Department of Science? But since everything in our modern life is indeed a kind of a scientific achievement, social sciences or the mechanical sciences or the physical sciences, a Department of Science would be overruling all the rest of them, or subsume all the rest of them. Doesn't really work. So I'm going to say this: the Ministry for the Future is the COP process, the Paris Agreement, and the United Nations. And these are weak in the world because of the nation state system and because of the sovereignty of the nation states. But all the nation states, or 190 of them, signed on to the Paris Agreement. And I was at COP26 in Glasgow, and it was a mind-boggling experience. I had 38 events in 12 days, and I was running around Glasgow in a literal sense of running. And what I saw there was alarming in some ways. The way that we got everybody to sign on to it was by a consensus rule that the statements that come out at the end of every COP have to be signed off on by every nation. A 100% consensus is very rare in politics. There is hardly any other organization that has that rule, actually. Usually majority rules or supermajority, but not everybody. So this is why COP is slow. But it's also necessary for all the nations to come together and make these promises. I began to think, this is like some kind of weird marriage. You go to the wedding, you make your wedding vows, oh my gosh, I'll be good forever. And then, there's a 50% divorce rate. And nobody, in other words, there's no sheriff. Once you've made these promises, if you break them later, there's no punishment for that. So we're in a system of mutual agreement that is like some vast global marriage where we all promise to do best by each other. And there's no possibility of divorce, really, that it doesn't kind of blow the house down. In other words, you can't move somewhere else. You're stuck with each other. So maybe this is one way to think of COP. But to get back to your question about ministries for the future, well, there are some constitutions that say it is our obligation to our biosphere, say Ecuador or Costa Rica. There are some constitutions that say that the human beings that are to follow us in the generations to come have legal standing now. And since you are trained as a lawyer, you know that actually having standing is a big issue. So, you know, in the early democracies, men, property owners, they had standing, no one else did. And one concept in legal thought is that the umbrella of standing, of legal standing, has been growing. And there's a famous environmentalist essay, "Do Trees Have Standing?" which is kind of a joke about, because trees stand, but in the courts, do they have standing? Well, the generations to come, do they have legal standing? And the biosphere and the wild animals, do they have legal standing? And so this is, I think, what the question devolves to when you ask, should there be a ministry for the future? Yes, there should be governmental and social responsibility taken for an obligation to these other living creatures, either to come or in the present in terms of wild animals, and they should have legal standing, they should have representation, they should be citizens. So yes, the more we move in that direction, the more protection we'll be giving to the biosphere, and that will be better for the generations to come. One could go on, and maybe we can later, the economic questions of that. How do you pay for this? That becomes crucial to the plot of my novel, and it's also crucial to world history going forward.
There's so many things I want to delve into, but I think I will say, and there's not enough time, maybe offline one day over a drink, you and I can have this discussion, but I do think the Paris Agreement was hugely important. I mean, the COP process sometimes is extraordinarily frustrating, especially when you're on the ground watching what's going on. But having a legal framework, I think, is important. Although in your book, while the legal framework is important, a lot of other things contribute to, you know, getting to where we need to go. So let's start at the very beginning of the book. It's pretty horrific. Who's read the book? I mean, some of you read the book. Some of you tried to get through. I had to actually do this interview, so I actually finally finished the entire book, but which I love the book, just as it was long. And I fall asleep, I read and then I fall asleep. But this heat wave in Uttar Pradesh, it kills 20 million people, and it's so horrific as you read it. And for many people here, I have worked, I think, or are working in development, I mean, you would know this. These things happen in places. I lived in Indonesia, I lived in East Timor, where the rest of the world doesn't really get it, right? Like maybe they don't even get it, they don't even get news of it. But this horrific incident happens, and I was thinking about both the heat wave in India, but then the flooding in Pakistan, where half the country was underwater. And I was thinking, like, do we even understand what's going on? Like, maybe there are incidents like you're talking about. I mean, obviously not 20 million people dead, but that it's so hot, we know this, the wet bulb, we're learning new language, the wet bulb temperature above which people cannot live, that people are dying, and even the water is so warm that you boil. So, but what was interesting about that is that you could see, you know, that's a very good device as a wake-up call. But it wasn't the recognition that happened that caused the unfolding of events. It wasn't that people in developed countries and, you know, said, oh my gosh, like people are dying, like, you know, all these people, 20 million people died in this incident, we need to wake up. It was actually the reaction in India by people that were the most marginalized, the most vulnerable, and people that were exposed or involved with that incident. Can you talk about that? Because that's not how we think about it. We always think if you experience the event or you see the event, you're gonna care, and we always hope that, especially, you know, I hope something happens, not that I want these terrible incidents, happens in Canada, we're all gonna wake up, or we see an incident around the world. But I thought it was interesting that wasn't what caused a whole cascading series of events. So maybe you could talk a bit about what happened and how you came up with that.
Yeah, thank you. That chapter was very hard to write, and people have reported very often that it's kind of brutal to read, of course. It was because I was scared. The news of the wet bulb temperatures being not survivable is new from about 2017. It's not that the facts weren't out there, but the way that the scientific medical community, along with the climate community, began to put all the pieces together and say that we're going to reach wet bulb temperatures, which is a heat index of heat and humidity, that humans can't survive without air conditioning, and that needs a power grid, and power grids go out in emergencies like that. I thought this story, it puts the lie to the notion that we could adapt to any rise in temperatures. Because this was something being said, especially in the States, oh, humans are so adaptable. So what if we have a 3.5 C degree rise in average global temperature? Big deal, we'll adapt. You can't adapt. So this puts a limit, a ceiling on how much we can heat the planet without catastrophe. One of the hottest wet bulb temperatures ever recorded was right outside Chicago. So the American Midwest and Southeast are susceptible to these kind of temperatures. And of course, Canada is very far north, but you had that extraordinary heat event out in Western Canada a year or two ago. Climatologists just said, well, that's impossible. That's 2 or 3 standard deviations off of what we thought was even possible. So shocking things like this can happen. But there seems to be a human ability to say, it's not going to happen to me. And this probably is what keeps us sane. We are all very good at saying, well, that happens over there. There's a famous story of a town in Ohio. The next town over got destroyed completely by a tornado, and the people in the town right next door said, well, they're in the tornado track and we're not. Which is just so typical. So it isn't a disaster in India that's going to change the world, although it's so likely that the global south is going to suffer. And Pakistan, indeed, that flood, my God, it's hard to imagine. And like you say, we're not really getting the imagery and the stories. It's not like we're in a world information scape that is total. Everybody tends to focus on their local situation, and the rest of the world, well, that's somewhere else. The problem is the somewhere else is the same little blue dot that you're on. We're in one biosphere. What happens in Chinese factories and how they cook up their electricity is going to give you asthma on the other side of the world. The melting of the permafrost in northern Canada is going to maybe release a big load of methane and carbon dioxide that will cook the whole world, etc. It's one planet we're in, and yet we're in this nation-state capitalist world that is not set up to be one planet or make decisions. This is why the Paris Agreement is so important, so crucially important. Even though it's weak, it's a place to talk about it. So in my book, I had the Indian government, over 1 billion people, the biggest democracy on earth, decide to take action unilaterally. We're not going to let ourselves be cooked anymore. And that is not even the decisive moment in the novel, because there's not going to be a decisive moment in history. We're going to be kludging forward with a lot of little motions that will hopefully be like bricks in a wall, and hopefully the wall will be big enough. So I wanted to even tell that story to make it more realistic and make the one's imagination of these next 30 years more shock resistant. There's going to be so many things going wrong that it's going to look like we've lost. But in fact, that could be a surface chop on an undercurrent that's stronger, where we're actually responding well. That's a complicated story to tell, which is why my novel is so long and messy. So.
Well, so it's interesting because I think that incident, it was shocking to read, and I think we need to all be shocked again and again and again, because we suddenly maybe have realized the impact we're having on the planet. But it not only motivates the Indian government to get engaged in geoengineering. I think that they were spraying sulfur dioxide in the sky, and they were mimicking the impacts of a volcano to lower the temperatures. But it also created, I don't know if that incident only, but it created a movement of eco-terrorists. And I think this is also something hard to read, right? Like, we get upset when someone, young people throw tomato juice or something on a painting. You can debate the merits, but this is like real eco-terrorism. It's like, there are bad people out there. They are, maybe fossil fuel executives, and so we're going to take action. And in a way, I hadn't really spent time thinking about this. And of course, I certainly wouldn't advocate for it, but you can see the level of desperation mounting, and folks, might start really taking things in their own hands, especially if they feel that leaders will not do anything for them. So talk about that, because it's quite shocking to imagine that, there'll be this branch, maybe in the Ministry for the Future, where they're actually taking, matters into their own hands and actually destroying buildings, but also people.
Yeah, well, you've put your finger on a sore spot there, Catherine. It's a tough thing to talk about, but I think you have caught my drift. If people are desperate enough, or if they've seen everybody in their village die, if they've seen their family die and they've survived it, then they're going to want not just climate justice, they may want revenge. Mm-hmm. And the levels of anger that may come into this world will be transcending our abilities to stop it or to stay safe, because anybody can blow things up. So I wrote this partly as a warning that we could do better than this, and that the people who imagine that they are the children of Khalil, they're going to lose control of their own violence, and the backlash will make it worse than what they wanted. There are very good books, Erica Chenoweth, Why Civil Resistance Works, that describe with historical examples that violent resistance often has a backlash, or even when it wins, it loses, whereas peaceful civil disobedience actually gets its political goals more often. Well, this is not an argument that's going to convince someone who's furiously angry and wants revenge, but it is important for the rest of us to remember that. So yes, the Ministry for the Future, Mary Murphy, she's traumatized by an encounter with a traumatized person, a survivor. She goes to her chief of staff and says, we might have to begin to do things that are kind of under the table, or you might say illegal. And he says to her, why do you think we aren't already doing that? The minister shouldn't know about these things, which I believe is how it happens in many governments. And so she's shocked at that information.
Not in the Canadian government, just so we're all very clear.
But Catherine, they never told you.
They never.
Yeah. So
okay.
Badim Badur, this is an Indian Nepali. His mother was Nepalese, his father Indian. He is the chief of staff and perhaps head of the Black Wing. He says as much to Mary Murphy. For the rest of the novel, you, the reader, are forced to decide, did Badim approve that? But also, would I approve that? For various radical actions in the book. Now, the book does not make a proper distinction between sabotage and murder. This is a really important distinction, especially for young people who are wanting to do more than vote or talk. Sabotage, well, maybe that's not violence at all. Maybe that's just breaking stuff that's killing the planet, killing the future. You break it, you should get a medal, not a jail sentence. Violence against people, always bad. Always wrong, always going to blow back in your face. I mean, history is filled with it, and people sometimes point to revolutions that were successful, that used violence to get there. Armed resistance in the open, or terrorism has never been particularly successful in its political goals, but armed or violent resistance against other humans sometimes. We don't have time for that. We're not in the world for that. It's an idealism or a kind of a fantasy life. Oh my gosh, we just have to change everything and then we can cure climate change. The harder thing is to imagine we can't change everything fast enough, and yet we still have to confront climate change. So it's one strand in my book. It's a confusing strand. I would send you to Andreas Malm or to Erica Chenoweth or Joshua Clover for a better discussion of that issue. My book, Mary Murphy ends up pushing for a carbon coin, pushing for finance to pay for doing the necessary green work in a way that people can make a living from it. So, and I would say that I did that, of course, on purpose. That was my decision as being the more viable and effective methodology for getting where we need to get.
I mean, it's kind of funny, a central banker saving the world. Hard to imagine. No, but so first of all, there's so much, and I've been given a sign that I have 5 minutes left, and I guess then I think we're taking questions. So there's so much I want to say. So I have to say, one, I love Mary. I love Mary. Mary is awesome because she is Irish, and my dad is from Dublin, and so I feel like an affinity to Mary. She is a swimmer. And swimming plays, I'm a big swimmer. If you follow me on social media, you'd be bored about my swimming all over the place. But she's also trying to figure out how the heck to tackle climate change. And she starts like kind of within the system. Then as you say, she's like, maybe we need dark ops. And they're like, guess what? We're not going to tell you. But, and then she just is like a hardcore pragmatist, but overthrow the system. And I remember it just Mary Marsh when I think that it's a quote in the book, is it, that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, which in a way is really true. I find that because in my space, like, we're even doing net zero. How do companies, how can they be net zero? And then they'll say, well, we have our fiduciary obligation to invest and make money, and there's a lot of money to be made in coal and oil and gas. Yeah. And then I stabbed myself because like we cannot continue to do this, right? Like it's very hard. But instead of just, you talk about geoengineering, and I like that, there's some people who are absolutists against things. I think you're more of a pragmatist. But I mean, in the end, as much as you want to overthrow the whole system, you come up with central bankers, but the carbon coin. And so I kind of know the opposite of the carbon, or the flip side of the carbon coin, which is carbon pricing. That was really hard. Maybe we should have done a carbon coin. Maybe that would have been easier because it's seen probably more in a positive way, although the idea is the same. How do you put a price on pollution, whether you get paid to not pollute or you save money or you pay a price if you do pollute? But talk about, I just thought in a way it was kind of funny, and I was like, well, I'm a lawyer and, I'm a pragmatist, so I guess this is the way, hopefully this is how it happens, even though, maybe it's less dramatic. But Mary goes, and she spends a lot of time talking to central bankers and trying to convince them. Now, they're not the easiest crowd, and they're actually not that exciting or entertaining, except for the Chinese woman. But she manages to get them on board. So is this what you think? Because I'm trying to figure out what I do with my life, right? Like I'm doing a bunch of things and I'm like, okay, what's the most effective? Do I talk about how bad it is? Do I focus on the clean technologies? Do I, focus on how do you hold people accountable? Do you figure out how to create the right incentives through the financial system? Is this the solution? Is this the magic thing that we need to focus on? How to change the economic system so that you have different incentives while you're not overthrowing the regime because we don't have time, by creating a coin that rewards behavior?
Yes, I think so. It's a matter of leverage, and it's the world we live in. So, okay, we live in the capitalist system, and even China is heavily involved in it, even though I believe them when they say they are socialism with Chinese characteristics because they have public ownership of their many of their major companies, state-owned enterprises. That's different. But they're in a capitalist world, and so are we all. And capital, which is to say a big enough money that you have gathered that you can invest it in something, investment money, capital, goes to the highest rate of return. Now that becomes super interesting. How do we calculate the highest rate of return? This is a crunch point that all universities and think tanks ought to be studying. We need a different rubric where the highest rate of return goes for the people doing the best biosphere work, rather than exploiting people and wrecking the environment in order to make short-term profits. So profits are, at this point in our system, a kind of measure of how much damage you've done, how much you've taken from other people, how much damage you've done to the environment and to future generations, and then you call it a profit, and then you get investment. So the highest rate of return, the rate of return and the measurement of it are crucial. Then also, people need to be able to make a living. saving the biosphere for future generations should not be a charity side project that you do while your work life is devoted to loss and damage, in effect. So how can that work? Well, we had quantitative easing after 2008's real estate crash. We had quantitative easing when the pandemic struck in 2020. Central banks create money from out of nowhere, and everybody trusts it. I'm putting this bluntly to be quick about it, but you see what I mean. Fiat money, which is the money that's backed by governments, the state, by armies and police, that money is the money that's real. Cryptocurrency is basically a kind of a scam, and like tulips for the Dutch in the 17th century, you bet on it and hope to make real money and get out of there as fast as you can. So I'm not talking about a cryptocurrency. I'm talking about fiat money, and the central banks create it, and they've done it twice now in living memory, 2008, 2020, about $5 trillion, although they have a hard time estimating this in 2008, something more like $10 to $15 trillion in 2020, generated by the banks to keep liquidity, to keep people alive. If there were, the central banks together were generating a quantitative easing of, say, $2 trillion a year per year that was by law to be spent on green work first. So this would be both legislative, so that's fiscal policy, and then also central banks tweaking money to keep it stable, that's monetary policy. If both of them agreed together that a certain amount of money from the get-go has to be spent in a green way, and then after that it just joins the general economy and has a multiplier effect. This is a kind of Keynesianism, and Keynesian economics was capitalist, but it ruled the world from the Great Depression until about 1973, 79, when it fell apart and was replaced by the neoliberal free market economy of Reagan, Thatcher, and so on. It's really been in charge for 40 years with immense loss and damage as a result. So back to Keynesianism, this, like you, Catherine, I'm a practical person. I'm thinking it's nice to have it's important to have values, dreams, goals, and utopian thoughts about how the world could be right. But we've got an active problem, a really big one. We have a current existing system. And so what in the currently existing system can solve that active problem? And so I was slowly but surely really kind of kicking and screaming, because believe me, no editor likes it when you say, I'm going to write a novel about the central bankers. This just does not fly. My editor several times said to me, Stan, you've got to be kidding me. You got a
lot of other things packed in there too, though, so good news.
Yes. Well, he said, make it in everything. Let's not spend too much time in meeting rooms, which I have already done in some previous novels that I won't even mention to you. Yes, it needed to be everything, but this is a real world thing. We need incentives. And so you talked about carbon pricing. So this is very funny, economists, the way they think. Essentially for economists, the carrots and the sticks are both incentives, and they both are equally valid. In fact, economists think that really penalties are more powerful than positive rewards in terms of getting people to act. Effectively, economists are saying that a kick in the butt or a kiss on the cheek are perfectly equal to human beings. And we know that's not true. We know that people would prefer to get the kiss on the cheek or the pat on the back or a helping hand than to get a kick in the butt or a spur in their butt. So social scientists, very often their work is semi-useless, I have to say, but they're doing the best they can because we are messy creatures. So what they're saying is the combination of sticks and carrots is more powerful than either one by itself. That a package of both inspires people because you can make your living at it. And if you put off to the side what's a profit, can we make a profit at this? Because at COP26, Mark Carney said to the world, I've got $130 trillion of assets here that have promised to spend it on green purposes. Well, they haven't been, but they could. This was an important announcement. If you could convince private capital, which is gigantic amount of money, to go green, then you'd be making progress in ways that suggest that we would squeak through this.
I will emphasize that the carbon pricing in Canada is revenue neutral, so all the money goes back. So it is a carrot and a stick at the same time. But now we're really nerding out.
Well done.
I think that we're now going to go to questions. There's so much more to say, and I don't know how much more I'll have to say about this. But what I loved about your book is that you deal head on with so many aspects of climate change. It's just so big, right? Because it's the science, it's what are the geoengineering opportunities, it's the the real human impact. You deal with inequality, you deal with the financial system, you deal with, all these different aspects, and you manage to make it into a book. Like, that's the amazing thing. And you bring it all together. And I really hope, because in a way, I'm a bit agnostic on why people want to act on climate. And so I hope when people read your book, they will see a reason why they should be motivated to act on climate. It may be the human aspect, the inequality aspect. It might be we need to reinvent our financial system, that we need to rethink about incentives. It might be the future generation piece, because I think all of those are hugely important, but your book is so incredible and so well researched that certainly everyone who's watching or who's in the audience, just really encourage you to take the time to read it, because it's wonderfully written, and it's also a really wonderful story. And at the end, it's kind of terrible, a lot of what happens, but it ends on an optimistic note, which is, I think, as you say, it's something we've been through a lot of hard years, and some days it can seem really hard working on climate, but there is a different future if we can do the work and be creative to get there.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. I just want to say before we go to questions, thank you for all of that. We are in terrible danger of crashing through some planetary boundaries really soon. So to say that we still have a good future possible is true, but it's getting
Very
less
narrow.
true every day. It's a narrow window that we're trying to jump through. I wanted to say also thank you. I am a novelist, and I worked hard on the craft of the novel. The Ministry for the Future has 106 chapters. They're short, they're various, they have different styles, they have different protagonists. There are a lot of nameless people talking in an eyewitness account way, and then they disappear forever. There's a lot about refugees, which I know that you have worked on. The climate refugees are going to be an enormous crisis situation going forward, no matter how well we do, and we have to make humane and realistic accommodations for that reality. And lastly, I just want to say that I too am a swimmer. My wife and I met in a master's swimming program, and
Nice. It all comes back to swimming.
Yes, get in the pool, and a lot of troubles go away.
Or open water. I prefer open water, although I did go to swim practice this morning. Okay, so now we're gonna. Anyone wants to talk about swimming? Apparently, Stan's willing to talk about his workouts. So handing it over back to you, Sophia.
Thank you so much, Catherine, and really enjoying the discussion so far. We will open up the floor in a few moments so that we can continue with this energy and field some questions from the audience. But before that, we do have a very, very quick pre-discussion quiz. So in a moment, the screen is going to light up with a QR code, and we encourage you to scan the QR code, use our Slido to answer our pre-discussion quiz. There are questions that are pulled from the content of the book, but they're fairly simple, so don't worry. Not testing you on anything too difficult here.
Stan, we're going to test you on whether you actually remember your book.
No, I would fail that one. Oh,
So
yikes.
you'll notice the first question is asking which of the following books does Stan author, and my hint to you is that there's more than one correct answer to this one. So you should be picking multiple.
Actually, I have to say, Stan, the reason I know this because I researched you, but also because it's Christmas time in my house, and one of my kids, I was like, oh, one of your other series would be a good fit. So
Yeah. Well, I can definitely answer this quiz.
I would be a little bit worried if you couldn't, Stan.
Yeah.
All right, so there are 3 correct answers: Red Moon, the Gold Coast, 3 Californias, and Aurora. I want to note American War because it's actually written by Omar Al-Akkad, who will be the author featured in our next Global Reads event.
Nice.
So we encourage you to attend that one. It's happening on December 6th. And the book that we will be focusing on is called What Strange Paradise. Perhaps we can flip over to the next question and see what folks had written down for this one. This one's quite simple. What do you think of when you hear the word climate change? What comes to mind? Share your thoughts. You might be enticed to write a whole paragraph or perhaps a whole 500-plus word page book, but we only have room for a few quick words here: greed, urgency, my children, daunting, shut it down.
I want to add extinction.
Yes.
Yep.
Actually, interestingly, that's the first thing that came to my mind, the 6th extinction.
Yeah, that's the one we can never claw back from, never.
I also see peace, inequity, anxiety, refugees, urgency. And future generations. I like that one.
Yeah.
Let's flip up to the next one. So the last question here is a what am I riddle that was taken from the book. You might have noticed that there were a couple that were presented throughout the book, and this one, I believe, was the very first one.
While people are answering it, I can say that riddles are about 1/3 of all of the Anglo-Saxon literature that remains to us are in the form of riddles. They're often jokes or puns with 2 answers. There's one Anglo-Saxon riddle where the answer is either a grasshopper or an angel. That's clearly on purpose.
Interesting.
Yeah, and the one that you've put up there, which people have got the answer, yes, is the very second chapter. This, my teacher, Frederick Jameson, who is still my teacher and very active, he read a manuscript version of Ministry for the Future, and he said, Kim, you can't do this. It's such a mess, all this nonfiction stuff. Why? And I said, well, because I want to, I need it. I mean, I'm surprised he would ask me that because he's such a wide-ranging literary mind. And so he pondered and woke me up with a call the next morning. He says, if you really want to do this, Kim, then the very second chapter has to indicate to the reader that there's going to be formal variety. Rather than surprising people at chapter 10 or whatever. Great idea. And so this particular riddle was stuck in there courtesy of Frederick Jameson. It's a wonderful teacher.
I appreciate that background and context. It makes it much more interesting. And yes, the correct answer is the sun. So good job to all of you.
That was
who guessed
very
that.
cool. This is like, my book club has to adopt this, I think.
Yeah. I can also add that my editor said, Stan, you cannot have these riddles without the answers. It's annoying. And I said, well, yes, I can. But then I went and I read them all. There's about 8 or 10. And 3 or 4 of them, I couldn't remember what the answer was. And I was annoyed. And so I thought, all right, Tim, you're right, I'm wrong. And so most of the riddles, only 2 of them don't have the answer, maybe because it's so obvious, but the rest of them have the answer at the end of the paragraph.
All right, well, I'm sure you all are really excited to open up the floor and have some discussion and questions. So we're going to do that now. I am going to start off with a question that was thrown in the chat box on Zoom, so we'll go to that first. But if anyone here in the room, if any of you have any questions, I hope you've been noting them down throughout the discussion. You will notice that there are 2 mics stationed right behind the chairs on either side of the room, and so we just encourage you to go up to the mic, adjust it if you need to, and pose your question that way. Does that sound okay? Wonderful. Okay, so I'm going to start off by reading a question from a Zoom participant. This is coming from Jane. Jane, thank you for the question. And here's what they have asked. How does shame relate to the phrase, why can't we just talk about climate change? Does shame, its positive and destructive qualities, affect the pushback of change, action for change? I'm going to read that part again. Does shame, its positive and destructive qualities, affect the pushback of climate action for change? And if so, how? How can we use shame to transform?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, it's famously true that you have shame cultures like Japan or Korea, or guilt cultures like the Catholic countries. It's interesting to contemplate the differences between shame and guilt and what might, which one is a more powerful driver of action. We were talking about kisses on the cheek versus spurs in your butt. These are both spur emotions, maybe. But shame is maybe so overwhelming that we repress it. If you feel shame, you often, rather than changing, you repress it or get angry and say, I have no reason to be ashamed of myself. And it's the other person who's trying to shame me who is at fault here. We're very good at defending ourselves from the feelings of shame because they're so powerful and negative. We don't want to feel those emotions. And a lot of times they're very harmful emotions. They don't help you to do better things. So if you think about what people 300 years from now are going to say about our generation, well, this is an incitement to feeling ashamed. We are like the French aristocracy before the French Revolution, you know, playing games and singing songs while people are starving. The developed world, this would mean the prosperous part of Canada, the United States, because there isn't universal prosperity, as we know. But that, I think, is one of the reasons why we don't do anything. We don't want to feel that existential sensation of shame. So I guess I would try to deflect it and say, everybody can do better. What would the Dalai Lama say in this situation? What would Buddhism say about these emotions? You do the best you can, and you're not going to be perfect. There is no afterlife. The present is the only reality. You got to do what you can in the moment that you've got, and dispense with both guilt and shame as being unuseful. That's what I would suggest, coming from a kind of a Buddhist perspective.
Mm-hmm. All right, I know lots of you have questions. I have no end of questions, but we've got a brave soul here.
Hi, I'm Steve. I'm with the Aga Khan Foundation. Great to have you both here. Like many readers, I'm sure I found the most hopeful parts of the book where you're talking about the various solutions that people are doing, whether it's the carbon coin approach or bringing water from below glaciers up to the top. And I'm so curious to know about how many of those are actually based in some kernel of reality or something that's actually possible, and how many are kind of inventions that you would hope to see.
Well, thank you for that. Mostly I got it out of the literature, and I functioned as a reporter rather than an inventor, which is lucky for me because I'm not an inventor and I don't have many ideas of my own. I look at the world and then I find the stories and I try to knit them together. The one about sucking water out from under the great glaciers to slow them back down to their previous speeds, that's speculative. Some glaciologists are talking about it. And whether it could work or not is a matter of needed experiment. I'm interested, and I'm going to write about it again to follow up that story because more has happened since I wrote Ministry on that one. As for the rest of them, Chapter 85 in particular is simply a list of green organizations doing good work with wild animals and with the biosphere more generally. And that I took right off of a Google map. Every single organization in there, except for one or two, is already existing, can be joined, and international. It's a Google map that it puts a pin around the world and gives you the organization. And the people who made it just made it by looking at YouTube and finding organizations that had a YouTube video about themselves. The data collection on the web is hard, but they managed it. Well, there must be many more organizations that haven't got a YouTube out there. So already existing organizations are there. And to get back to the carbon coin briefly, the Network for Greening the Financial System is a network of 110 central banks, including all the big ones, trying to figure out how to green money itself. I did not know about this network when I wrote Ministry, or else I would have seized on it. And so that idea, which looked kind of speculative in 2019, it turns out they were already on it. And I find that very, very encouraging, because believe me, I don't feel capable of inventing anything that will help us. And when I notice something going on in the world, think that would be good if people were thinking about it. They already are thinking about it. So this is reassuring.
On a follow-up while we're waiting for someone to come, two things. One, your wife is a scientist, is that right, Stan?
Yes, indeed. She is an environmental chemist, a water chemist for the U.S. Geological Survey.
So she keeps you honest. That she reads this and she's tough on when you put things down on paper.
She's given up on keeping me honest.
Oh, okay.
It's a matter of, Stan, you got to be kidding me. Why would I venture to say anything about, say, nuclear power when I'm a water chemist? So she's rather strict as a scientist. She's no help at all.
She's no help
except
at all.
for this.
I doubt that.
No, that's not true. The way that she's a help is I've seen a scientist at work, and I've seen a whole lot of scientists working together in their collaborative way. Peer review, which is done for free, the intensity of trying to be fair to the data and to not skew it. So I've watched her at work now for 40 years, and that's a lesson in itself in how hard people can work and how hard scientists work in general, and how they have a social goal, but they would like to convince everybody that it's just the obvious, objectively right thing to do the good things for the biosphere.
All right, we do have some questions, so.
Okay, hi, my name is Bruce.
Bruce.
One of the things I struggle with, I'm sure we've all encountered it, is just the prevalence of short-term thinking in our governments and our among citizens and businesses. I read somewhere that we're hardwired to think typically no more than a year into the future, and maybe that's the crop cycles and such. But how do we, in your opinion, convince people, persuade people in governments and organizations that we need to take a much longer view if we're going to solve climate change?
Oh, it's a good question. Now, some of it immediately gets wonky, as Catherine said, or financial. The discount rate, the way economists in government and in private practice put a discount on the future is simply a percentage number picked out of the blue. There is no scientific or objective basis. It's an ethical judgment. And there are economists who say the discount rate should be zero, which would mean that all the future generations are equally important to ours. And if you postulate that there's going to be lots of them, then suddenly we become a minority and a kind of caretaker for future generations. And that's expressed in our economic system by way of the discount rate. Then also long-term returns. The investment capital of the world, they want certainty. They want liquidity and volatility in order to make a lot of money fast. So the people who actually play with money don't mind volatility. It's a chance for them to make money because they'll make money whether the market or the value of the dollar goes up or down. They've hedged their bets. But if there were long-term rewards backed by the central banks, that if you invested in them, the money would go to green work, and meanwhile you had a guaranteed return that was in fact very long out there. I don't know, 50 years or a century. not all the money should go there because then you have a liquidity freeze. But if enough money went there, sort of like treasury bonds in the state, the benchmark, the bedrock that you can count on even when everything else falls apart, that can be constructed and offered. And that's, I think, part of what the greening of the financial system is about, is to make sure that there are long-term investments that are certain to pay off while helping the biosphere. And also pointing out that short-term profits by extraction and exploitation, that there's going to be nobody to feed you, or there's going to be no money at all if the biosphere crashes. So again, making a different profit and loss statement, making a different accounting system, making a different highest rate of return. These are technical, and yet they're crucial, because we do live in a world where money really matters. And then to the larger question, because I don't mean to stay stuck at the level of finance too long, even though I think it's important. These are moral questions. These are questions of increasing the sense of humanity to include the wild animals as fellow citizens. And so we cannot have an extinction event. And also the future generations, as the humans that will be here after we're gone, they will judge us. We won't be there for it, but they will be judging us, and they will be wanting to live a life in a biosphere that takes care of them like it took care of us. So you can extrapolate to your children. People will throw themselves in front of a bus for their child. It's famously said that for your child, you throw yourself in front of a bus. For your grandchild, you give them $100 to go to college. And for your great-grandchildren, do you really know them at all? They seem the same as any other tiny little kid. The dissipation of feeling of responsibility, of parental responsibility, is apparently pretty rapid. But on the other hand, it's an act of the imagination, the moral imagination, to say, wait a second, my grandkid is as important to me as my kid. And not only that, but other people's grandkids are as important to me. So you get this one planet, everybody, brothers and sisters together, a kind of horizontalization of care that is a moral act, a religious position. Mm-hmm. And that's really important, I think.
Got another question?
Thank you. Hi, my name's Kerry, and you've mentioned some things that are great segues into what I'm trying to ask about. We clearly have the solutions and lack the political will that would then orient the discount rate and the economics in a certain direction. If parenting were enough, I suspect we'd already be there. It's clearly not enough. So my question is, Greta had us, I thought, on the verge right before the pandemic hit. She had kids out in the street. She had young people who saw a very bleak future ahead of them, realize that they have to take matters into their own hands and convey their views. So not future generations unborn, actual future generations that are here. How important do you think that is going to be in terms of getting the message out, and in terms of holding political feet to the fire, and maybe sending the signal, hey, governments, just like in the United States, we actually made the difference between a red wave in this last election. We're going to make differences in future elections, and if you don't listen to us now, you're going to be out on your butt. Cheers.
Yeah, well, I hope that becomes more important. It would be great if it did. Young people are famously uninvolved as citizens when it comes to the somewhat secular religion of voting. And the more that they vote, since their own interests, since they're going to be living to the year 2100, many people alive on the planet today will be alive in 2100 looking around. And there will be vast changes in this century that they will have to live through and try to ride that wave and control it. So the more they're involved, the better. Greta was a great spur in the bud. I don't like it when she says blah, blah, blah to climate negotiators. She's talking to the wrong parties there, and should be talking to big capital, to private investment capital. So this generalized anger of the young, like it's all adults, well, it's understandable, but it's inaccurate, and you're going to need a little accuracy and a little precision. One thing my wife, the scientist, taught me is that for statisticians and other scientists, there's a difference between accuracy and precision, which I, as a writer, I love to know. So you need to, here's how it can be flipped also. Baby boomers, my age, born after World War II and before, say, 1960, that's a gigantic demographic surge. And so Bill McKibben's third act, where people who are older, who are retired, who are not going to live till 2100, nevertheless get out there and try to encourage the youth and try to work for the youth. And so it shouldn't be put on young people who oftentimes don't have the actual political power to do anything but protest. That's important, and if they vote, even more so, and they can become involved in green work. Almost anything that young people are going to do today could be turned green and made a positive and give meaning to their lives. It's all rather promising for young people. For baby boomers and people my age, then this is a chance to make one last strike for justice, which when we were young, we quite believed in. And so I'm always a little worried about the splitting into generations. I'm going to say this, we're all alive at the same time in 2022, everybody who is alive. 500 years from now, they are not going to be able to tell the difference between a 20-year-old and a 70-year-old. The people alive in 2022 are all equally responsible for us going forward. And of course, as a practical matter, the more the young are involved, the better off we're going to be.
So I think we have some online questions. Is that okay?
Yes, we have time for one more question, and I've pulled one from an online participant. This comes from Joanne, and their question is, there's a conversation in the book that suggests that we need a new / old religion. Can you elaborate a bit on that?
Yes, and thank you. It's a good way to end. And I also want to say that I have been doing a thing where if the organizers of this event would like to send the chat questions to me that I've not been able to answer, I can write a velocity exercise, very quick replies, send them back to the organizers, and then they can be distributed out if you want to do that. It's kind of fun for me. The velocity exercise is an old writing exercise where you just go as fast as you can and quit after 2 minutes, no matter what you've done. I'm happy to do that. And now, yes, religion. Well, Gaia, say that the biosphere of the earth, all of its living members, that life wants to live, and that 50% of the DNA inside your body is not human DNA. So we are all communities, like a forest or a swamp or whatever. We're biomes. Just as individuals, our skin is not a border. If you hold your breath for a minute or hold your breath for 2 minutes, if you can, you'll realize that you're just interpolated with this biosphere completely. And you know, the oxygen keeping you alive was created by other little creatures living on the planet. This Gaia might not be the right word for it because it's specifically a Greek goddess, a rather tough, mean goddess, which is maybe true. But one planet, and also biosphere. The life on Earth is an integrated thing where no person is an island. You know, the bell tolls for all of us when something dies or when something goes extinct. It's like cutting your foot off. So this religion has like a lot of them, has strictures, has a code of conduct, things that you shouldn't do and things that you should do for a larger cause than yourself. So I guess I'm plumping down for a name that is just one planet, but I think there's something to be said for, especially in our culture, the kind of Anglo-Western European cultures. Gaia is a way to think of it. It's appropriate to think of it as a mother figure. Of course, one has to be careful about genderizing, blah, 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 blah. But mothers have a special role to play in most living creatures, especially mammals. So Mother Earth, Gaia, one planet, this is the religion. And luckily, most of the already existing religions have tapped into that older one. I believe that's the first religion. I believe it's maybe 150,000 years old, and the various shamanisms are remnants of it, or evolved examples of it that still exist today, but were heavily hammered by colonialism. So this indigenous, there's a lot of talk now about learning from indigenous people. It's very appropriate, but it's not a matter of plant biology or even ecological lessons, although those are all important, and indigenous knowledge is powerful for that level. Way more important is the spiritual view, and the indigenous spiritual view, that we are part of the earth. So there you have it.
Well, that is I think, a lovely way to end, because in the end, I mean, maybe we can tackle climate change by getting the central bankers and changing the incentives. But I think also important is that people believe in something that's bigger than themselves, and that we're all connected wherever you are, if you're, in Uttar Pradesh or you're down the street. But the sign of a great book is it stays with you, and you have lots of different threads that you're going to think about. And I think that's really probably how all of us feel. And certainly looking forward to your next book. Maybe you're going to tackle all these different angles that you mentioned that you haven't quite finished, some of your geoengineering or other pieces. But I think this was a really, really great conversation, and keep it up, because we need people that think and talk about climate change differently and have a broader impact. As much as I think COPs are important, I think they seem very exclusive, even the language, and I think telling stories like you do is extremely important. So, and of course, a thank you to the Aga Khan Foundation, because I know you do believe we're all connected, and you work very hard to make sure that we address inequalities and we tackle big issues like climate change.
And I say that I want to thank you also, and also the Aga Khan Foundation. I wish I could have been there in person. The whole big face on the wall thing is a necessary convenience, but it would have been fun to be there in person. I also want to thank Catherine very much, not just for your questions, but for all of your work. I mean, it's actually quite easy to sit in your chair and tell these stories on your laptop. It's a matter of writing sentences. I enjoy it, and I regard it as easy. Doing it in the real world, in collaboration and in opposition, fighting for these causes in the real world, it's amazing. And so I want to thank you.
Thank you.
I also want to extend a huge thank you to everyone in the audience for being here today, for those participating on Zoom, and for anyone who asked any questions, and for Stan, your incredibly comprehensive and insightful answers to those questions. I now have the fun job of picking a winner for our book draw. So I have a physical copy of Stan's book right now in front of me, and many of you entered our book draw, and I'm just going to pull from this bowl that I have here in front of me. So, oh no, here's the challenge of reading another person's handwriting. Manuel? Is Manuel here? Wonderful. Hey. Come on up and collect your prize. Is this your copy? Okay, I think we have okay. I have another copy for you, Khalil.
Hey, very good.
And we also have a wheel for a spin wheel for the online participants. So we're going to go ahead and spin the wheel and see who wins online.
This is super cool, everything you're doing here.
Dun, dun, dun. Totally random. Paul Horseman.
Paul.
Congratulations, Paul. We will make sure to mail you a copy of the book so that you have it, a physical copy as well. Well, thank you all. I am now going to pass it off to Khalil to give some closing remarks, and then we do have a lunch out there for you afterwards.
Thanks very much, Sophia. Let me just reiterate our collective gratitude, first to Stan for the gift of this book. and for everything that it represents. We've had a wide-ranging conversation today. The part that has stuck with me the most, however, is its call for us to, reacquaint ourselves with a certain kind of ethical sensibility that, like this pandemic we've just been through taught us that a virus knows no boundaries and doesn't carry a passport. I think climate change as a phenomenon doesn't carry a passport. Our ethical responsibilities don't only not carry a passport, Stan has taught us, but maybe don't carry the weight of timelines either, that they should transcend both borders and calendars. And I think that is a very demanding ethical stance that all of us, I think, need to confront, and one which both this conversation and the book stirred in me. And to Catherine McKenna for her lifetime of service to this country and indeed to the world, but also very specifically for bringing our attention to this book, for orchestrating such an insightful and thoughtful conversation, and for continuing to challenge and call this country to a level of global citizenship, which I think humanity now needs. So thank you to you both. Thank you all for participating. I want to thank Global Affairs Canada, who is a partner of ours in convening events like this here. We do have two other events coming up. One later this week, which is a debrief of COP with a few people who were there, who will help us reflect a little bit on it, especially on this loss and damage element that was referenced here. And then on December 6th, Omar El-Akkad's extraordinary work that is really a reflection on forced migration, which was also referenced here today, will be in conversation with the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees representative here in Canada. That was her choice for her edition of the book club. So I hope you'll join us for that. Lunch is served, and I hope you'll stay in touch. Thank you.